The first sign that something was wrong came 3 days before my wedding. I was sitting at my kitchen table with invitation cards spread around me when my fiancé, Aidan Brooks, walked through the door looking pale. His tie hung loose around his neck, and he would not meet my eyes. Normally he kissed me the second he came home. That night he barely said hello. I laughed nervously and asked if work had been rough, but he just stared at the floor. Then he asked me a strange question. Would you still love me if your father hated me forever? My stomach tightened. My father, Walter Hayes, had never approved of Aidan. Dad believed money solved every problem. Since Aidan worked as a public school teacher, Dad acted like he was beneath our family. Every dinner turned into a battle. Aidan stayed polite, but I saw the hurt in his face every time. I told Aidan none of that mattered because we were building our own life. He forced a smile, but his hands shook. That night, after he fell asleep beside me, I noticed his phone lighting up again and again. One message stayed on the screen long enough for me to read it. Take the offer before it disappears. Welcome to Revenge Tamara. If you've ever been betrayed, overlooked, or underestimated, you're in the right place. Comment your location, like this video, and subscribe because once you start watching you won't want to stop. My name is Evelyn Hayes, and until that week, I believed my life was finally becoming perfect. I was 29 years old and worked as a children's librarian in Charleston. I loved quiet mornings, old books, and rainy afternoons with coffee and music playing softly in the background. Most people expected me to become part of my father's business empire, but I never wanted that world. Dad owned half the downtown buildings and treated every relationship like a business deal. He controlled everything around him with money, pressure, and fear. Growing up in that house felt like living inside a glass cage. Then I met Aidan. He was patient, funny, and honest in ways I had never experienced before. He remembered small things like how I hated olives on pizza and how thunderstorms scared me at night. When he proposed beside the river 8 months earlier, I cried so hard that strangers started clapping. For the first time in my life, I felt chosen for who I truly was. But my father hated losing control over me. Dad wanted me to marry someone powerful, wealthy, and useful to his business connections. Aidan was none of those things. The closer our wedding came, the colder my father became. And deep down, I started fearing he was planning something terrible. The next morning, I tried convincing myself the text message meant nothing. Maybe it was from a friend. Maybe it was work-related. But fear kept scratching at the inside of my chest. At breakfast, Aidan barely touched his food. I finally asked him directly if something was wrong. He looked at me for a long moment before shaking his head. Just stress, he said quietly. But the answer felt rehearsed. Later that afternoon, my best friend Naomi stopped by to help me organize wedding decorations. While we folded ribbons across my living room floor, she suddenly froze near the window. "Evie," she whispered, "isn't that your dad's car?" I looked outside. Dad's black sedan sat across the street. Aidan walked out of the house 10 seconds later. My heart dropped. I watched him cross the road and slide into the back seat beside my father. Naomi grabbed my arm before I could run outside. "Wait," she warned. The car stayed parked for almost 15 minutes. When Aidan finally returned, his face looked drained of color. I asked where he had been. He hesitated. "Just getting air." I stared at him in disbelief. He had never lied to me before. That night, while he showered upstairs, I opened the drawer beside his desk searching for answers. Instead, I found a sealed envelope containing $100,000. And my father's signature rested on top. My hand shook so hard that several bills slipped onto the floor. $100,000. More money than Aidan made in years. At first, I tried believing there had to be another explanation. Maybe Dad offered a loan. Maybe it was connected to the wedding somehow. But deep inside, I already knew the truth. My father had tried buying my fiancé. I stuffed the money back into the envelope seconds before Aidan came downstairs. He immediately noticed my expression. "What happened?" he asked. I held up the envelope. The room went silent. For several painful seconds, neither of us moved. Finally, he sat down heavily across from me. "I was going to tell you," he whispered. The betrayal cut through me like ice. "You accepted money from my father." "No," he said quickly. "I didn't spend it. I didn't agree to anything." Then he explained everything. Dad had called him to his office 2 days earlier. He offered Aiden the money if he disappeared before the wedding. Dad claimed I would eventually thank him for saving me from a poor marriage. I waited for Aiden to say he threw the money back in Dad's face. Instead, he lowered his head. I took the envelope because I wanted proof. Tears burned my eyes. "Proof of what?" "That your father will never stop trying to destroy us." The next day, I confronted my father at his office downtown. The building smelled like expensive leather and polished wood. Employees scattered the second they saw my face because they knew I was furious. Dad remained calm behind his giant desk. "I assume Aiden told you," he said. "You tried paying him to leave me." Dad leaned back casually. "I offered him an opportunity." My anger exploded. "You cannot control my life forever." His expression hardened. "You are too emotional to see what kind of man he is." "He refused your money." Dad laughed softly. "No, Evelyn. He accepted it." The words hit me hard because technically they were true. Dad opened a folder and slid photographs across the desk. The pictures showed Aiden entering Dad's car and leaving with the envelope. "Men show their true character when money appears," Dad said. "Your fiancé failed the test." I hated that part of me wondered if he was right. Dad stood and walked toward the window overlooking the city. "When your mother married me, she understood loyalty," he continued. "You inherited her heart but not her judgment. My mother died when I was 17. Dad rarely mentioned her." Before I could respond, he added something that froze me. "If you still marry him Saturday, don't expect my support after the ceremony." I stared at him. "You'd cut me off." "I'd protect the family from your mistakes." For the first time, I realized my father saw love as weakness. I left the office shaking with anger and confusion. Part of me wanted to call off the wedding immediately. Another part wanted to fight for the life Aiden and I had planned together. That evening, Naomi came over with takeout and sat beside me on the couch while I cried. "You need to decide whether you trust Aiden," she said gently. I thought I did. She stayed quiet for a moment. "Then ask yourself one thing. Before your father got involved, had Aiden ever given you a reason to doubt him?" The answer was no. Never. Aiden had supported me through panic attacks, grief anniversaries for my mother, and endless family drama. He loved me when I felt impossible to love. But betrayal changes everything. Later that night, Aiden came home carrying flowers. He looked exhausted. "I know you're hurt," he said quietly. "But I swear I never planned to leave you." "Then why didn't you tell me immediately?" He swallowed hard. "Because your father threatened to destroy my career if I exposed him. And honestly, I was ashamed I even touched the envelope." I believed his shame was real. He sat beside me carefully. "I should have handled it better," he admitted. "But I love you, Evie. Nothing your father offers could change that." For the first time in days, I wanted to believe our future might survive. Then his phone buzzed again. This time the message came from an unknown number. "Saturday changes everything." I barely slept the night before the rehearsal dinner. Every strange detail from the past week replayed inside my head. The money, the secret meetings, the threats, even the text messages felt dangerous now. Still, I forced myself to attend the rehearsal because canceling would mean my father had already won. The ballroom looked beautiful when we arrived. White roses covered every table, and golden lights reflected across the dance floor. Guests laughed while waiters carried trays of champagne through the room. Dad stood near the entrance greeting people like a politician. The second he saw me beside Aiden, his smile faded. Dinner started smoothly until Dad tapped his glass for attention. Everyone quieted. "I'd like to say a few words about marriage," he announced. My stomach dropped. He spoke about loyalty, honesty, and responsibility. At first, his speech sounded harmless. Then he looked directly at Aiden. Some people enter relationships for love, Dad said. Others enter for opportunity. The room became painfully silent. Aiden clenched his jaw but stayed calm. I stood up immediately. That's enough. Guests shifted awkwardly in their seats. Dad ignored me. A husband should provide stability, he continued, not dependency. Before I could respond, Aiden slowly rose from his chair. I may never impress you, he said steadily, but I will never stop loving your daughter. For 1 second I thought the nightmare was ending. Then Dad smiled. And that terrified me most. After the rehearsal dinner, I found Dad alone outside near the parking lot. Cold wind pushed against my dress while anger boiled inside me. You humiliated him on purpose, I snapped. Dad adjusted his coat calmly. I'm trying to protect you. You're trying to control me. His expression darkened. You think love is enough because you've lived a sheltered life. I laughed bitterly. Sheltered by who? For a moment he actually looked hurt. Then he said something unexpected. Your mother once trusted the wrong person too. Froze. What does that mean? Dad stared toward the street. She almost lost everything before I stepped in. Before I could ask more questions, his lawyer, Gerald Whitmore, approached us carrying a briefcase. Gerald had worked for my father since childhood. He looked nervous when he saw me. Sir, he said quietly, the documents are prepared. Dad nodded. I noticed Gerald glance at me with something close to pity. That unsettled me more than anything. As they walked away together, I suddenly remembered something strange from earlier that evening. I had overheard Gerald asking Dad, "Are you sure she doesn't know?" At the time, I assumed they were discussing wedding finances. Now I was no longer certain. When I returned home, Aiden was already asleep. I lay beside him staring at the ceiling for hours. Every instinct told me secrets were hiding beneath the surface of our family. And somehow, Saturday would expose all of them. Wedding morning arrived gray and rainy. Most brides probably woke up excited. I woke up terrified. Naomi helped me get ready inside the bridal suite while makeup artists hurried around us. My dress hung near the window like something from a dream, but my stomach twisted harder every minute. You can still walk away, Naomi whispered while pinning my hair. I looked at my reflection. I don't want to walk away from Aiden. Then what are you afraid of? I opened my mouth but couldn't answer. Because deep down, I feared my father had planned something bigger than humiliation. An hour before the ceremony, Gerald unexpectedly arrived at the suite. He looked uncomfortable. Your father asked me to give you this after the wedding, he said, handing me a sealed envelope. Why after? Those were his instructions. Before leaving, Gerald hesitated near the door. Then he quietly said, some truths should have been told years ago. My chest tightened. What truths? But he only shook his head and walked away. I almost opened the envelope immediately. Instead, I shoved it into my bag. Maybe I was scared of what waited inside. Minutes later, music echoed through the chapel. I stood. The doors opened. And as I stepped onto the aisle toward Aiden, I noticed my father watching us with the coldest expression I had ever seen on his face. The ceremony began beautifully. Aiden looked at me like I was the only person in the world. For several precious minutes, I forgot the chaos surrounding us. Then everything shattered. Just before the vows, the chapel doors burst open. My father stood there beside two men in dark suits. Gasps filled the room. I object to this marriage, Dad announced loudly. My heart nearly stopped. The minister looked stunned. Sir, this is highly inappropriate. Dad raised a hand. I have legal grounds. Gerald hurried forward carrying several documents. Guests whispered in confusion while cameras turned toward the chaos. Aiden stepped protectively beside me. What are you doing? He demanded. Dad ignored him. Before this ceremony continues, My daughter deserves to know the truth about the man she's marrying. Gerald unfolded the papers with trembling hands. I was instructed to read a financial agreement signed earlier this week, he said. The room became completely silent. Then Gerald began reading. Payment issued to Walter Hayes in exchange for arranging the cancellation of Evelyn Hayes' marriage to Aiden Brooks. The chapel erupted. I blinked in confusion. Gerald stopped reading suddenly. Dad's face lost all color. "You idiot," he hissed. But Gerald stared down at the page in horror. He had read the wrong document. Not proof against Aiden. Proof against my father. And every guest inside that chapel had heard it. The silence inside the chapel felt suffocating. I stared at my father, waiting for him to deny everything. Instead, panic flashed across his face for the first time in my life. Gerald shuffled through the papers frantically. "There must be some mistake," Dad snapped. But the damage was already done. Aiden slowly turned toward him. "You paid someone else too." My father's jaw tightened. Felt dizzy. "Who were you paying?" asked. Nobody answered. Then Gerald whispered the words that changed everything. "Your mother." The chapel spun around me. "What?" Gerald looked devastated. "The agreement was drafted 29 years ago. Your father paid your mother to leave another man before marrying him." Gasps echoed again. Another man. My mother had loved someone else. Suddenly, memories returned from childhood. The way Mom sometimes cried alone while listening to old records. The hidden photograph I once found of her beside a smiling young man Dad tore apart when he discovered it. Aiden grabbed my hand before I collapsed. I looked at Dad. "Did you force Mom to marry you?" His silence answered everything. The truth hit me like a wave. My father was not trying to protect me from repeating his mistakes. He was terrified I would escape the kind of marriage he created. The ceremony completely fell apart after that. Guests whispered loudly while reporters outside somehow learned about the scandal within minutes. Naomi escorted me into a private room behind the chapel because I could barely breathe. Aiden stayed beside me the entire time. Dad tried entering twice, but Naomi blocked the door both times. Finally, Gerald knocked softly. "I need to explain," he said. I almost refused to let him inside. But I needed answers. Gerald sat across from me looking older than usual. "Your mother was engaged before she met your father," he admitted quietly. "She loved a musician named Thomas Reed. The name meant nothing to me. Your grandfather disapproved because Thomas was poor. Walter offered money to make him disappear. Felt sick. And my mother. She never stopped loving him." Tears filled my eyes immediately. Gerald lowered his head. "She discovered the truth years later. After that, your parents' marriage became difficult. I remembered the endless coldness between them before Mom died. Suddenly, another terrifying thought entered my mind. Did my mother know Thomas had been paid? Gerald hesitated. "She learned shortly before her death." My heart pounded. Mom died in a car accident. At least that was the story I had always been told. Aiden noticed my expression immediately. "Evie," he whispered carefully, "what are you thinking?" I looked toward the door where my father waited outside. And for the first time in my life, I wondered if I truly knew him at all. I refused to leave the chapel until I spoke to my father alone. Aiden wanted to stay, but I needed the truth without interruption. Dad entered slowly after everyone else cleared the room. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted, older somehow. Finally, I asked the question burning inside me. "Did Mom know you paid Thomas to leave?" Dad stared at the floor. "Yes." The answer crushed me. "When did she find out?" "A year before she died." My throat tightened painfully. "She hated you after that, didn't she?" His silence said enough. Then I forced myself to ask the darkest question. Was her accident really an accident? Dad looked horrified. "How could you even think that?" "Because I don't know who you are anymore." For the first time, tears appeared in his eyes. "I loved your mother," he whispered. Love doesn't control people. He looked away. You don't understand what it feels like to lose someone before you've even had them. I laughed bitterly. That's exactly what you tried doing to me. Dad walked closer carefully. I saw the same pattern repeating. A man with no resources. A future built on struggle. I would rather struggle with someone who loves me than live trapped beside someone who bought me. Those words hit him harder than shouting ever could. When I left the room, Dad remained standing there completely alone. And despite everything, part of me still pitied him. Outside the chapel, reporters crowded the entrance like vultures. Cameras flashed everywhere. Naomi helped me sneak through a side exit while Aiden drove us toward the coast. Neither of us spoke for almost 20 minutes. Rain hit the windshield steadily while my mind replayed everything Gerald revealed. Finally, Aiden pulled into an empty beach parking lot. He turned off the engine. "What happens now?" he asked softly. I stared at the ocean. I don't know. The truth was, I felt emotionally destroyed. My father had manipulated my mother's life, then tried repeating the same cycle with mine. Every childhood memory suddenly felt unreliable. Aiden reached for my hand. "I should have told you immediately about the money." He nodded. "Yes, you should have." Pain crossed his face. "But I also understand why you panicked." He looked surprised. I took a deep breath. My father spent years making people fear him. Even me. For the first time since this nightmare began, honesty flowed freely between us. Aiden admitted he worried Dad would ruin his teaching career permanently. Dad had threatened lawsuits, false accusations, and financial destruction. Hearing that made my anger return stronger than ever. Then Aiden said something unexpected. "There's one more thing you deserve to know." My stomach tightened instantly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out another envelope. For $500,000. I stared at the check in disbelief. $500,000. Enough money to change almost anyone's life. "When did he give you this?" I asked quietly. "The day before the rehearsal dinner." My chest tightened again. "And you kept it?" "I kept it because I planned to expose him after the wedding." I searched his face desperately for lies. "What stopped you?" "You." Aiden rubbed his forehead tiredly. Suddenly, my phone exploded with notifications. News articles about the wedding scandal were already spreading online. Videos from the chapel had gone viral within hours. One headline froze my blood. "Businessman Walter Hayes exposed in wedding corruption scandal." Below the article sat another update. Thomas Reed had seen the story, and he wanted to speak with me personally. The next morning, I met Thomas Reed at a small diner near the harbor. I expected bitterness. Instead, the older man who stood when I entered looked kind. His gray hair curled slightly at the edges, and his nervous smile reminded me painfully of someone. "My mother." "You have her eyes," he whispered. Emotion hit me immediately. We sat in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "I loved your mother more than anything." I believed him instantly. Thomas explained how he and Mom planned to leave town together after college. Then suddenly, he received money and threats from my grandfather and father. "They said I would ruin her future," he admitted. "Why didn't you fight for her?" Pain crossed his face. I was 23 and terrified. He revealed that Mom contacted him years later after learning the truth. "She wanted to leave Walter," he said quietly. My heart stopped. "But she stayed because of me." Thomas nodded slowly. "She said she couldn't risk losing custody of you." Tears blurred my vision. Everything my mother sacrificed suddenly became clear. Before leaving, Thomas handed me a small box. "Your mother wanted you to have these someday." Inside were dozens of letters. Letters Mom had written but never mailed. The first line of the top letter shattered me completely. "I hope my daughter grows up brave enough to choose love over fear." I spent the entire night reading my mother's letters. Some were written before I was born. Others came years later during lonely nights after Dad traveled for work. Every page carried heartbreak. Mom described feeling trapped inside a life she never truly chose. But she also wrote constantly about me. She feared I would grow up believing money mattered more than kindness. She worried Dad's influence would eventually harden my heart. One letter stood out more than the others. If Walter ever tries controlling Evelyn's future the way he controlled mine, I pray she fights back. By sunrise I had made my decision. I drove straight to my father's mansion. Security guards looked nervous when I entered because reporters already surrounded the property. Dad waited inside his office looking exhausted. He barely slept. I placed Mom's letters across his desk. She never stopped loving Thomas, I said. Pain flashed across his face. I know. Then why hold on to someone who didn't want to stay? His answer came quietly. Because losing her felt unbearable. I stared at him sadly. And now you've lost me too. Those words finally broke him. Dad lowered his head into his hands. For the first time in my life, he looked less like a powerful businessman and more like a lonely man drowning in regret. But regret could not erase what he had done. One evening, I found Aiden sitting alone on my apartment balcony staring into darkness. "You okay?" I asked softly. He gave a tired shrug. "I'm wondering whether loving you will always come with chaos." The words hurt because they were honest. I sat beside him quietly. "You can walk away if this is too much." He looked shocked. "Is that what you want?" "No." "Then stop pushing me away whenever things get difficult." His frustration finally surfaced. "You keep acting like your father is the only one capable of making choices. But you're choosing too, Evie. Every time you shut down, every time you assume betrayal before trust." I realized he was right. My father's manipulation had infected the way I saw love itself. Aiden took my hand gently. "I don't need your father's approval. I just need you to believe me." For the first time since the wedding disaster, I fully understood something. Fear was slowly turning me into my father. And if I kept letting fear control me, I would destroy the very relationship I fought to protect. A week after the failed wedding, Gerald requested another meeting. This time he looked terrified. We met privately at his law office downtown. "There's more you need to know," he admitted. My stomach tightened immediately. Gerald explained that after the chapel incident, several old documents connected to my father's business dealings had resurfaced. Among them were records proving Dad secretly paid people for years to manipulate personal relationships and business rivalries. "He used money to control outcomes," Gerald said quietly. "Not just with your mother." Felt sick. Then Gerald revealed the worst part. My father was under federal investigation. Apparently, one payment involved bribing a judge years earlier. I leaned back in shock. "Does he know?" Gerald nodded. "He's preparing for possible arrest." Despite everything, sadness washed over me. Dad spent his entire life building power only to watch it collapse because he could never stop controlling others. Before I left, Gerald handed me another envelope. "Your father wanted you to have this." Inside sat a handwritten letter. Not type. Not prepared by assistants. Real handwriting. I opened it later that night beside Aiden. The first sentence made tears immediately fill my eyes. I became the kind of man my daughter would eventually fear. For the first time, my father finally sounded honest. Dad's letter stretched across 12 handwritten pages. He admitted things I never expected him to confess. He described growing up poor and watching his own father abandon their family after losing money. From childhood, he learned to associate love with instability. When he met my mother, he became obsessed with keeping her. "I convinced myself that securing her future justified everything," he wrote. But control slowly replaced love. The letter also revealed something surprising. Dad had secretly attended every school play, library fundraiser, and birthday event I ever had, even when work kept him away publicly. Sometimes he sat in the back unnoticed because he did not know how to connect emotionally. Reading that complicated my anger. He loved me. Just badly. Near the end, The letter became painfully honest. When I saw Aiden looking at you the way Thomas once looked at your mother, I panicked. I realized you might experience the kind of love I destroyed. I cried quietly after finishing. Aiden wrapped his arms around me while I shook. You don't have to forgive him immediately, he whispered. I know. But I also knew carrying hatred forever would poison me. The next morning, news broke that federal agents had searched my father's offices overnight. And for the first time since childhood, I truly feared losing him. 3 days later, my father was arrested. Television cameras captured everything outside the courthouse. Seeing him led away in handcuffs felt surreal. This was the same man who once controlled entire rooms with a single glance. Now he looked defeated. Reporters shouted questions while he avoided every camera. Then suddenly, he looked directly at me standing across the street. The sadness in his eyes nearly broke me. Later that evening, I visited him in jail despite Naomi warning me not to go. Dad looked exhausted inside the visitation room. For several awkward seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he asked quietly, "Did you read the letter?" "Yes. I meant every word." I nodded slowly. Then I asked the question haunting me since childhood. "Did you ever truly love Mom?" His eyes filled instantly. "Every single day." "Then why hurt her?" He gave a weak laugh. "Because frightened people sometimes destroy the things they love most." That answer felt painfully true. Before leaving, I told him something honest. "I'm still angry. You should be. But I don't want my life defined by this anymore." Dad nodded slowly. "Then choose differently than I did." As I walked away from the visitation booth, I realized something important. Breaking family cycles sometimes begins with refusing to repeat them. Life slowly became quieter after the arrest. The news eventually moved on to fresher scandals. Reporters stopped camping outside my apartment. Even social media lost interest. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe normally again. One Saturday morning, Aiden and I visited the small riverside spot where he proposed. The weather felt warm and peaceful. "No photographers," he joked. I laughed for the first time in days. We sat near the water talking honestly about everything that happened. The fear, the lies, the damage. Aiden admitted the scandal nearly convinced him we were doomed. "I kept wondering if your father would always stand between us," he said. "And now," he squeezed my hand. "Now I think the only thing standing between us is whether we choose each other every day." That sentence mattered more than any wedding vow. Then he reached into his pocket nervously. My eyes widened immediately. "You're not serious." "I am." He pulled out my engagement ring. "I know the first wedding became a disaster," he said softly. "But I still want the marriage." Tears filled my eyes. "You're proposing again. This time without ballrooms, rich guests, or your father's approval." I laughed through tears. "Yes." Aiden smiled with relief. Then he added, "And maybe we elope before another lawyer ruins everything." 2 weeks later, Aiden and I drove quietly to Savannah with Naomi as our witness. No giant guest list. No luxury ballroom. No dramatic speeches. Just us. The small courthouse overlooked a beautiful park filled with oak trees and sunlight. Everything felt calm in a way our first wedding never had. Before entering, I checked my phone one last time. A new message waited from my father. "I'm sorry for every moment I made love feel conditional." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I typed back, "I hope you learn how to forgive yourself too." Inside the courthouse, the ceremony lasted less than 10 minutes. Aiden held my hands while promising to choose honesty even during fear. When it became my turn, I promised never to let someone else's bitterness shape our future. Simple vows. Real vows. After signing the marriage papers, Naomi burst into happy tears. "You two survived the most insane engagement in history," she declared. Aiden laughed. "Please don't say that too loudly. The universe might hear you." For the first time in months, happiness felt uncomplicated. As we walked outside into warm afternoon sunlight, I realized something beautiful. Love did not need grand performances. It only needed truth. And finally, truth was no longer hiding from us. 6 months later, life looked completely different. Aiden continued teaching at the same public school because he genuinely loved helping children. I returned to the library full-time and even started hosting reading programs inspired by my mother's old letters. People still occasionally recognized us from the wedding scandal online. But now the story felt distant, like another lifetime. Dad eventually accepted a plea deal that avoided prison time but destroyed much of his business empire. He moved into a smaller house outside the city and started attending therapy. At first, I doubted he would truly change. Then one afternoon, I visited him unexpectedly. I found him cooking dinner alone while old jazz music played softly through the kitchen. Mom's favorite music. "You remembered," I said quietly. He nodded. We talked for nearly 3 hours that night. Not about money or reputation. About grief, regret, fear. For the first time, Dad admitted he spent most of his life terrified people would leave him if he stopped controlling them. Before I left, he handed me a framed photograph. My mother smiling beside Thomas Reed before everything fell apart. "She deserved to be remembered honestly," Dad whispered. I realized then that healing rarely arrives all at once. Sometimes it begins with small acts of truth after years of lies. Last month, Aiden and I celebrated our first wedding anniversary beside the ocean where we once hid after the ruined ceremony. The beach looked peaceful under the evening sunset. We brought sandwiches, cheap sparkling juice, and a blanket that kept sliding across the sand whenever wind blew. Perfect, honestly. At one point, Aiden asked whether I regretted everything that happened. I thought carefully before answering. The easy answer would have been yes. But the truth felt more complicated. Without the disaster, I might never have learned the full truth about my parents. I might never have understood how fear quietly destroys love from the inside. Most importantly, I might never have realized how strong real love becomes when honesty finally replaces control. "I regret the pain," I admitted softly. "But not where it led us." Aiden smiled before pulling me closer. As the sun disappeared across the water, my phone buzzed with a new message from Dad. "Thinking about your mother today. She would have been proud of you." For once, the message carried no manipulation. No hidden pressure. Just honesty. I looked out across the ocean while warm wind brushed against my face. Then I finally understood something my mother tried teaching me through every letter she wrote. Love built on freedom survives. Love built on control eventually breaks everything.